This video was made possible by my supporters on Patreon. Please use the link in the description below to subscribe and help support my ongoing projects. The History of the Kings of Britain by Geoffrey of Monmouth, translated by Benito Sereno. Book 1, Brutus of Troy. While rolling over various things and various topics in my mind, I came across a history of the kings of Britain, and I was amazed that among the accounts that Gildas and Bede had made of them in their brilliant treatises, I had found nothing about the kings who had lived there before the incarnation of Christ, nor even anything about Arthur and the many others who succeeded him in the years after the incarnation, even though their deeds remain worthy of eternal praise and were enjoyably proclaimed by many people and known by heart, as if they had been written down. So since I was kind of mildly obsessing about this stuff, Walter, the Archdeacon of Oxford, a man well-versed in both the arts of speaking and in foreign history, brought me this super old book written in English that lays out the acts of all their kings, from Brutus, the king of the earliest Britons, all the way up to Cadwallader, son of Cadwallon, in order and without interruption in nice prose. And so, inspired by his request, even though I haven't studied enough to pluck florid word flowers from other writers' word gardens, content in my own rustic style, I've made an effort to translate that book into Latin. To be honest, if I had drowned the page in bombastic turns of phrase, I would bore the reader, since they would have to linger more on teasing out my words than on understanding the story. And so, to you, Robert, Earl of Gloucester, I hope you will bless my dumb little project with corrections, and so that with you as teacher and advisor, people will judge it not to have arisen from the meager fount that is Geoffrey of Monmouth, but seasoned by the salt of your wisdom, it will be called the product of you, the offspring of Henry, illustrious king of the English, you whom a love of learning trained in the liberal arts, you whom an innate goodness made a leader of men in the army. This way, the Britain of today will give thanks to you in our times, that they have received in you another Henry. Britain, the finest of islands, once known as Albion, is situated in the western ocean between France and Ireland. It's 800 miles long and 200 miles wide, and anything that meets the needs of mortal men, it provides in never-diminishing supply. It's abundant in every kind of metal, and it has widely expansive fields, as well as hills that are excellent for farming, in which a wide variety of crops prosper in their own season, thanks to the richness of the soil. It also has forest groves filled with every type of wild beast, in whose glades the grasses are good for a change of pasture for animals, and whose colorful flowers provide honey to buzzing bees. It's also got green meadows pleasantly situated under lofty mountains, in which crystal springs, flowing in sparkling rivulets with a soft murmur, lead those lying on its banks into the gift of a sweet and deep sleep. Furthermore, it is watered by lakes and fish-filled rivers, and from the narrow channel in the south that they use to sail to France, 3 well-known rivers stretch out like 3 arms, namely the Thames, the Severn, and the Humber. By means of these rivers, overseas products are brought by boat from every nation. Once upon a time, it boasted of 28 different cities, some of which grow squalid in desolation with crumbling walls, but some of which are still standing, with beautiful churches of the saints built up with lofty towers, in which pious gatherings of men and women show deference to God according to the Christian tradition. But is also fruitful with all sorts of birds. It has salt flats and hot springs. Grapevines even grow in certain areas. Finally, it's inhabited by 5 nations, namely the Normans, the Britons, the Saxons, the Picts, and the Scots. Of these, it was once the Britons who occupied everything from one sea to the other, until, as divine retribution for their pride, they were forced to yield to the conquering Picts and Saxons. But how and from where they steered their ships remains now to be written and will be made clear in the following sections. Aeneas, after the war in Troy and the destruction of that city, fled with his son Ascanius, arriving in Italy by boat. While there, after having been warmly received by King Latinus, he attracted the ill will of one Turnus, the son of the king of the Etruscans. When the two men finally came together, they tussled, and Aeneas came out on top, killing Turnus and gaining for himself both the kingship of Italy and the hand of Lavinia, Latinus's daughter. It was from her that Aeneas called the town that he built Lavinium, which he reigned over for 4 years. When he passed on from this life, the throne was taken up by his son Ascanius, also known by the name Silvius Julius, whom he had fathered in Troy with his wife Creusa, the daughter of King Priam, and whom he brought with him to Italy. But Ascanius left the kingdom of his stepmother Lavinia and established the city of Alba Longa by the Tiber, taking the ancestral gods of his father Aeneas with him from Lavinium into Alba Longa. The idols, however, returned to Lavinium under their own power. Even when they were brought back again to Alba, they once more sought out the shrines of their former home. Nevertheless, with all appropriate duty, Ascanius brought up his brother Silvius Posthumus, son of Lavinia, and after he had reigned for 34 years, he named Silvius as his only heir. Silvius, however, seeking to indulge a secret love, got married to a certain niece of Lavinia and got her pregnant. When this was revealed to Ascanius, his guardian, Ascanius ordered his wizards to figure out the gender of the baby the girl had conceived. The wizards replied that she was pregnant with a boy who would kill both his father and his mother, and who, after wandering the wide world in exile, would at last achieve the highest of glory. This prophecy, it turns out, was actually true. When the day of the child's birth arrived, the woman brought forth a son, but died in the process. Nevertheless, the boy was handed over to a nurse, and they named him Brutus. When Brutus was 15 years old, he accompanied his father on a hunting trip and, aiming an arrow at some stags, accidentally shot and killed his father. Now, with his remaining family enraged at him, Brutus was driven into exile. The banished Brutus set sail for Greece, where he came upon the children of Helenus, the son of Priam, who were being kept as slaves under the power of Pandrasus, king of the Greeks. As it turns out, Pyrrhus, the son of Achilles, had abducted Helenus and many others after the destruction of Troy and brought them back with him in chains in order to avenge the death of his father. Recognizing them as his own family and fellow Trojans, Brutus stayed with them and began to grow so much in his military skill and virtue that he was loved by the kings and chieftains more than all the other young men of the country. He was smarter than the smarties, tougher than the toughies, and whatever gold, silver, or other spoils he gained for himself, he always shared all of it with the other soldiers. And so, once reports of his courage and virtue spread throughout the whole land, everyone of the Trojan race who was living in that place started to come to him, begging him, if it was at all possible, to rescue them from the servitude to the Greeks. They felt quite confident that it could actually be done, but only if they had a leader who could skillfully command their numbers in battle against the Greeks. Because, as it turns out, their numbers had grown so much in this country that they now totaled some 7,000 battle-ready men, not counting women and children. Plus, there was a certain noble young man among the Greeks named Assaracus, who favored the Trojan cause, having been born of a Trojan mother himself. He had 3 castles, which his dying father had bequeathed to him, but which he and his brother fought over vigorously. The brother wanted to take these over from Assaracus, since the latter was born of a concubine. He had total confidence that with the Trojans' help he would be able to fight off the problems the Greeks were giving him. The other brother, however, being Greek on both his father's and mother's side, knew that the king and the other Greeks had his back. And so once he had seen the large number of men and the quality of their fortifications, Brutus agreed to the Trojans' request with greater confidence. At any rate, Brutus was made leader, and he called together all the Trojans and fortified the towns of Assaracus. But he himself and Assaracus took the non-military men and women and occupied the hills and woods. Then he sent a letter to the king, which said, "Dear Pandrasus, king of the Greeks, greetings from Brutus, leader of the remnant of Troy. It's not right for the nation rising from the illustrious race of Dardanus to be oppressed under the yoke of servitude, or to be treated in any way other than what their nobility demands, so that nation has hidden itself away in the woods, preferring to live like wild animals on meat and grasses, but in freedom, than to wallow in luxury under the yoke of slavery. If this offends your majesty, don't hold it against them, because all these captives want is to return to their former dignity. I hope you will have mercy and grant them their lost freedom, allowing them to live in the forest groves which they now occupy as an escape from servitude. If you won't make this concession, at least let them leave in peace to some other country as free men." Pandrasus, the one keeping them as slaves, rejected the Trojans' letter, and was actually so gobsmacked by the very gall of it, he immediately followed the advice of his court and decreed that an army should be assembled to violently curtail those so rudely occupying his land, and to this end he quickly made his way to the town of Sparentinum. Brutus, however, came to meet him with 3,000 sturdy Trojans and made a surprise attack against him, resulting in absolute carnage for the Greeks. Worse, the Greeks, astonished and caught off guard, scattered in every direction and hurried to cross the river Achelon, which flowed nearby. Most of them died in the attempt. Brutus pursued the fleeing Greeks and laid them low with his sword, some among the waves, and some on the riverbank. But Antigonus, the brother of Pandrasus, saw this massacre of his men and was pretty put out about it. He called his scattered allies back into position and returned to make a swift attack against the raging Trojans. He would rather, it turns out, die fighting than drown in muddy water trying to run like a coward. And so, with his allies drawn together into a tight battle line, he led them forward, urging them to fight like men and hurl their deadly spears with all their might. The bold Trojans, however, stood firm and brought their wholesale slaughter to completion, taking Antigonus back as a prisoner. And so Brutus, having achieved victory, secured the town with 600 soldiers and made his way back to his refuge in the woods, where the common folk of Troy were hiding with their wives and children. But Pandrasus, wildly upset that he himself had run away and his brother had been captured, spent the whole night going around and gathering up his scattered people, and when the sun rose the next day, proceeded to besiege the town in which he assumed Brutus was huddled up with his brother Antigonus. He attacked the town's walls by distributing his army and troops so as to encircle the town, and gave orders to the various groups so that some blocked anyone inside the city from getting out, some dammed up the rivers, and yet others worked at breaking down the wall's fastenings with frequent blows from the battering ram and other engines of war. Once they had carried out these commands to completion, they strove with all their might to make even crueler trouble for the besieged. The besieged, however, fought back bravely from the walls, driving away the enemy's siege works with all manner of weapons, and brimstone torches launched their way. Eventually, though, worn out from this daily effort and lack of supplies, they sent a messenger to Brutus, asking him to rush to their aid so that in their weakness they wouldn't be forced to desert the town. When Brutus received this message, he gathered his men together and spurred them on to the aid of the townspeople. But because he didn't have a big enough army to engage with the enemy in open battle, he devised a clever plan in which he proposed that they would sneak into the Greeks' camps at night and, while distracting the guards, kill them in their sleep. And so he secretly summoned Anacletus, the ally of Antigonus who had been taken captive together with him, and with his blade unsheathed addressed him with these words: "Noble youth, the end of your life and that of Antigonus is at hand, unless you faithfully execute everything I say to you now. I want you this coming night to carefully distract the Greek guards so that I have safe passage to approach the others. You need to take care of business as skillfully as you can. In the second hour of night, proceed to the blockade and lie to the guards that you have rescued Antigonus from my prison and chains, and that you have brought him as far as that ravine in the woods where he's hiding in the bushes, unable to leave due to Trojans in pursuit of him, who have surrounded him to keep him from returning to his brother in freedom. Once you've fooled them with this story, lead them to the ravine where we will be awaiting them. And you." And Anacletus, seeing in the midst of these words the sword that threatened his life, was pretty freaked out, so he swore with a solemn oath that he would carry out the job he had been assigned, if his life and that of Antigonus would be spared. And so, with Anacletus' betrayal of his people confirmed, he began to make his way toward the blockade. But as he got close to the camps, he was caught by Greek scouts who recognized him. So he put on an enormous air of relief and said, "Help me, men! If you aren't fake friends, save me and your beloved Antigonus from the hands of the Trojans. I brought him all the way to that ravine over there after having broken him out of Brutus's prison this very night. Look, he's hiding in the brambles in the thick part of the forest, afraid that he'll be recaptured by the Trojans." When the Greeks heard what Anacletus had to say, they didn't hesitate at all, rushing to grab their weapons and follow him to the ravine. But when at last they passed through the bushes, Brutus and his army popped out and suddenly leapt into their midst, attacking the terrified Greeks and laying a most severe slaughter upon them. Afterwards, Brutus divided his allies into 3 troops in preparation for breaking up the Greek blockade. Each troop was ordered to head into a different part of the camp without making any noise or killing anyone until Brutus himself, having arrived at the king's tent, blew the signal on his war trumpet. And so all of Brutus's men, having received their instructions, withdrew into the camp. Once the trumpet had sounded, they drew their swords without delay and fell upon their half-asleep foes with naked steel, dismembering those who tried to grab weapons, but slaying with no less zeal those who were unarmed or asleep. The others were awakened by the groans of the dying, and in shock at what happened, they too were cut down by their enemy. The Greeks didn't have enough time to grab weapons or enough space to run away because the soldiers had surrounded them on all sides and were slaughtering them like sheep in a pen. Those who were presented with an opportunity for escape merely fell headlong in the darkness of night and were dashed against the cliffs of the ravine, breaking their arms and legs in the fall. Those who managed to avoid both of those fates simply didn't know where to run and were drowned in the nearby rivers. Hardly anyone was able to escape misfortune, because at this point even the townspeople, cheering on the arrival of their fellow Trojans, were taking up arms and doubling the destruction. But Brutus had at this point arrived at the king's tent as he had said he would, and though the king's allies had all been killed, Brutus took pains to capture the king alive, because he had decided that he could more easily attain his goals with the king alive than dead. But the troop that was with him did not stop making a mess of the area which had fallen to them until they had laid it to utter waste. As a result, under the light of dawn, with such a great ruin lying revealed before them, Brutus, swelling with joy, commanded his allies to distribute the spoils however they saw fit. After this had been done, he went into the town with Pandrasus, giving over the bodies of the slain to be buried. The next day, the illustrious General Brutus summoned the elders of Troy and asked them what they thought should be done about King Pandrasus, and what demands they should make of him. And they, so long held in slavery, answered in different ways, with some suggesting they should ask for a portion of the kingdom that they could live in, and others simply suggesting the freedom to leave and the things that would be needed for such a journey. The matter was debated for some time until one of them, Ambricius by name, stood up and said, "Fathers and brothers, I'm not sure what the confusion is here on this life and death matter for us. We have to take the second option, the freedom to leave, if you want to secure life and peace for you and your children. If you let Pandrasus live just so he can give you a patch of Greece to live in the midst of that despicable race, the Argives, you will never know any kind of long-term peace, because the brothers and sons and nephews of those on whom you just delivered this absolute carnage will still be among you. They'll be your neighbors. They'll never forget you murdering their parents. That kind of hatred doesn't go away. And you can't fight back against them because our numbers are smaller, while theirs will only increase generation upon generation. And if some kind of internecine squabble arises amongst you, their numbers will increase by the day, while yours only diminish. For my part, I suggest, that is, if it seems reasonable to you, that we ask the king's firstborn daughter, whom they call Imogen, be given in marriage to our leader, and that they give us all the gold, silver, ships, rations, and whatever else that will be necessary for a journey. And if they agree to this, we can seek some other land with his permission." When he had finished speaking, the whole group of elders assented to his plan and suggested that Pandrasus should be brought before them, and if he didn't agree to their requests, he would be condemned to a most brutal death. Without delay, he was brought out and given a choice. Either give his daughter to be Brutus's wife, as I said before, or he and his brother would die. To which he responded, "Life is preferable, is more important than all other things in my estimation. So even though it is against my will and I am being coerced under the threat of death, I will give my daughter, against her will as well, to this foreign man, my enemy. Nevertheless, I do take some solace in the fact that I am giving her to wed an upright and noble man whose reputation makes clear that he is truly born of the race of Priam and Anchises. For who else could have snatched the exiled Trojans from their chains when they could have been burdened with subjugation to so many great masters? Who among them could have fought back against the king of the Greeks, or engaged his mighty hordes in battle with so few men, and even chained the king himself once the battle had been begun? Because so great a youth could oppose me with so much honor, I do grant him my firstborn daughter, Imogen. I do grant also gold and silver, ships and grain, wine and oil, and whatever else you deem necessary for your journey. And if you change your mind and decide to remain among the Greeks, I will give you a third of my kingdom to live in. But if you are firm in your decision, I will make good on all your demands." With the meeting adjourned, emissaries were sent to every Greek shore to gather together ships, which totaled 324 altogether, and load them up with all kinds of grain. The king's daughter and Brutus were married, and everyone showered them with gold and silver, as was only proper. When all this had been taken care of, the sails were raised, and the Trojans set off amongst favorable winds. But Imogen, standing high upon the rear deck, would often collapse into Brutus's arms in a swoon. Her tears poured out in gasping sobs as she grieved the loss of her parents and homeland, and she never turned her eyes away from the shores of Greece for as long as they were visible. Brutus did his best to calm her with soft words, sweet embraces, and loving kisses, and he did not give up in these efforts until, exhausted, she cried herself to sleep. Their journey was an easy one as they plowed through the seas for 2 days and a night until they reached a certain island called Laodicea, which, thanks to a devastating pirate attack, was completely deserted of any inhabitant whatsoever. The island's ancient temples remained standing, however. The Trojans discovered a wide assortment of wild animals on the island, allowing them to refresh their ship's food stores through the bountiful hunting the place offered. However, they soon came upon a certain deserted city in which they discovered a temple to Diana, where a statue of that very goddess would answer questions posed to it. And so, making the appropriate offerings, they thought to ask the goddess for advanced knowledge on their future travels, including which nation they should choose to be their new permanent home. With everyone agreed on this line of questioning, Brutus, together with Geryon the prophet and 12 of the older men with him, decked his temples with garlands and penetrated into the deepest parts of the temple. In front of the most ancient shrine where the altar of the sculpted goddess stood, he held in his right hand a vessel filled with sacrificial wine and the blood of a white doe, and with his face upright before the image of the deity, he broke the silence with these words: "Goddess great of wooded glade, who makes the bristled board afraid, who can the bends of heaven tread and walk the pathways of the dead, help us find our promised land, tell us where our home should stand. If shown our homeland's constant shore, we'll worship you forevermore. 1,000 temples shall be thine, with virgins dancing at your shrines." After he said all this 9 times and circled the altar 4 times, he poured out the wine he was holding over the hearth which he had set aflame for the sacrifice. Then he lay down on top of the hide of the white doe which he had stretched out in front of the altar, and soon fell asleep, quite unwillingly. When the 3rd hour of the night approached, the goddess appeared standing before him and said, "Brutus, beneath the setting of the sun, beyond the lands of Gaul, there is an island ocean, enclosed by a watery wall, that once was home to giants, but now is clear and free. Seek this land, for it shall be a stalwart home for thee. Noble Troy, reborn again, shall be this island now, to birth a line of mighty kings, to whom the world shall bow." When the Trojan leader awoke from this vision, he wasn't sure if it had been a dream or if the goddess had in fact told him in her own voice of the land he was soon to reach. Eventually, he called in his men and told them in order everything that had happened to him as he slept. They then hurried back to the ships, and with a favorable breeze blowing them along a speedy course, they reached Africa in the space of 30 days, then the lakes of Selene and the altars of the Philistines. From there they sailed between the straits of Rusicata and the mountains of Azara. Here they suffered an extremely dangerous attack by pirates, but they achieved victory against the invaders and got rich off the spoils. Then they crossed the river Malva and arrived at Mauritania, where, because they were out of food and water, they disembarked and plundered the whole land from coast to coast. Once their ships had been restocked, they made their way to the Pillars of Hercules, where sirens, those monsters of the deep, appeared to them and surrounded their ships, nearly destroying them. Nevertheless, they slipped out of their clutches and passed by the shores of Spain, coming to the Tyrrhenian Sea, on whose shores they came upon 4 generations of exiled Trojans who had been companions of Antenor in his flight from the city. Their leader was named Coroneus, and he was a man of considerable strength and nerve. If he were ever to grapple with anyone, even a giant, he could immediately lay them out as if they were a tiny baby. When he realized that Brutus's crew were his own people from generations back, he joined them, together with a sizable portion of the people he had been in charge of. Finally, arriving at Aquitaine in the mouth of the Loire, they dropped anchor and stayed there for 7 days, scouting the area of this kingdom. At that time, the king of Aquitaine was Geoffrey, the Pict. When he heard rumors that a group of foreigners were crossing the borders of his kingdom, he sent messengers to find out whether they brought peace or strife. Making their way towards the Trojan fleet, the messengers came across Coroneus, who had just gotten off the ship with 200 men to go hunting. They called out to him and asked why he had trespassed upon the forests of the king to hunt without permission. It turns out it had been a law there since old times that no one could capture wild beasts in that place without the go-ahead from the prince. Coroneus replied that he had had no idea about the prohibitions of the king, and he had never heard of any such rule anywhere else, and he thought it was pretty stupid. When he heard this, one of the Aquitanians, named Himbert, pulled back his bow and shot an arrow at him. Coroneus, however, dodged it and smashed Himbert's head to bits with his own bow. Himbert's allies scattered to the winds to tell Geoffrey about the murder of Himbert and let him know that powerful enemies had arrived. The king was greatly aggrieved and straightway gathered an enormous army of Pictavians to turn their attention toward the Trojans and avenge the murder of Himbert. When Brutus was informed of their approach, he readied the ships and ordered the women and children to stay in the camp. He then went out with a large number of battle-ready men to meet King Geoffrey. And so the skirmish began, with fierce battle being joined on every side. When much of the day had been consumed by battle action, Coroneus was embarrassed that the Aquitanians were resisting them so boldly and that the Trojans weren't winning. As a result, he doubled down on his boldness and summoned all his allies from the right side of the battle. He formed them into a column and made a swift attack on the enemy and cut them down left and right. Once they broke through the battle line, he forced every Aquitanian into flight. Good fortune provided him with an axe when he had lost his sword, with which he split everyone he encountered from stem to stern. Brutus, his allies, and even their enemies were amazed at the man's courage and strength. And Coroneus, waving his axe at the backs of the men who were running away from him, taunted their fear with these words: "Where are you cowards running to? Where are you lazy bones going? Come back, I beg you. Come back and face Coroneus. Shame on you. So many thousand of you run from one man? Well, running away was the right move, because this right hand you see here is known to drive off the giants of Tyrrhenia, lay them low, and send them off to hell, 300 and 400 at a time." At Coroneus's words, a certain consul named Suhartus surrounded him with 300 soldiers and attacked him. But Coroneus had not forgotten his axe, and brandishing it against the haughty consul, cleaved him in half from toe to tip. In a flash, he then fell upon the rest of them, and swinging his axe, massacred them, running first here, then there, severing one man's hand from his arm, removing another's arms at the shoulders, and shortening another man's height by a head. Every man fell upon him alone, and he alone fell upon every man. Brutus saw all this from afar, and moved by the man's passion and virtue, ran with a troop of men to help him. Soon an enormous uproar rose up, and blow was multiplied upon blow, quickly turning into a brutal slaughter on every side. Before you know it, the Trojans had achieved total victory and driven King Geoffrey and his Pictavians to retreat. And so Geoffrey fled into the territory of the Gauls to seek aid from his friends and relations there. At that time, there were in Gaul 12 kings under whose regimes the whole country was ruled equally. These all received Geoffrey warmly and unanimously promised that they would expel these foreigners from the borders of Aquitaine. But Brutus, pleased with the victory, enriched his allies with the plunder of those they had destroyed, and then gathered them back into troops and squads so that they could spread throughout the country and lay waste to it thoroughly. And so he despoiled the fields, burned the cities, and dragged the hidden riches out of them, inflicting a terrible butchery upon the citizens and common folk. And while he was assailing the lands of Aquitaine with such great destruction, he came upon the place which is now the city of Tours, which, as Homer attests, he himself built up and established a camp there, so that, if the need arose, he and his men could withdraw there. When the camp was completed 2 days later, bad news, Geoffrey returned with a huge army gathered from every corner of Gaul. Casting his pitiless eyes upon the camp of the Trojans, in a fit of melancholy he burst out with these words: "Oh, pitiful fate! Look at this camp these savage exiles have built in my kingdom. My kingdom! Arm yourselves, men. Arm yourselves swiftly and hurry to the fight in well-ordered troops. Let there be no delay in our capturing these half-men like sheep in a pen and selling them as slaves throughout our kingdom." All the Gallic allies armed themselves according to the commands of King Galfar, and arranging themselves into 12 columns charged upon the enemy. In contrast, the Trojans disposed of organized troops altogether and boldly took the Gauls on. The Trojans prevailed in the scuffle and made a huge bloody mess out of their enemy, totaling nearly 2,000 men. Despite this, the Gauls had superior numbers and kept increasing their forces more and more. The Gauls kept coming in from all sides at numbers nearly 30 times that of the Trojans, and although they were hard-pressed at first, they nevertheless eventually regrouped and made a harsh attack upon the Trojans, forcing them to retreat to their camp. Now, being besieged by the Gauls, the Trojans devised a plan under the silence of night, whereby Corynaeus and his men, divided into several squads, would sneak out under the cover of darkest night and hide in the nearby woods until dawn, so that when Brutus, having come out at daybreak, engaged with the enemy, Corynaeus and his men could pop up unexpectedly from the rear, and thus they could catch the Gauls off guard and attack them from both sides. And so that's what they did. While it was still early, with the rays of day just beginning to shine, Brutus came out of the camp with his men and engaged with the Gauls. Men were laid low with injuries on both sides, and before Corynaeus could appear with his men against the army, Brutus's nephew, Turnus by name, a man of such great courage that there was no man present among the Trojans stronger and bolder, except maybe Corynaeus himself, fell in battle. He alone had laid low 600 men with just his sword, but he ended up stabbed full of holes by an onrushing multitude that he had been pursuing by himself. It's from his name that the future city on that site took the name Tours, because Turnus had been buried there. By this time, however, Corynaeus had snuck up from the rear and fell upon the enemy. The Trojans experienced a surge in the boldness and especially the bitterness of their fighting due to the desire to avenge the death of Turnus, and thus laid the Gauls low and slaughtered them without ceasing. Eventually, the Gauls, surprised by the racket made by Corynaeus' men as they came in from the rear, which led them to believe that there were more men than there actually were, took to flight and hastened to abandon the field of battle. But the Trojans, keyed up to the point of savagery, chased them down the whole way. With total victory thus accomplished, Brutus sounded his trumpet to signal withdrawal, ordering his men to turn back and meet up at the camp. He commanded them to return to the ships in case the enemy managed to regroup and return in even greater numbers than before, so that they would not be able to fight them off, but instead come only into even greater danger. Once he had finished his address, they all returned to the fleet and filled the ship with the various riches they had attained. And so, with favorable winds and the gods smiling upon them, they sought out their divinely promised land and set aground in the port of the river Dart, which today is called Totnes. The name of this island at the time was Albion, and it was inhabited by no one except a handful of giants. As the island was replete with pleasant locales, rivers full of fish, and lovely forest groves, it instilled in Brutus and his allies a great desire to settle there. And so the Trojans spread out through the country and came upon some giants that they immediately chased off into the mountain caves. But on a certain day on which the Trojans went out to pour libations to the gods according to custom in that port, they had made their sacrifices and were beginning to celebrate their holiday when the giant Gog-Magog arrived with 20 other giants. They charged in the middle of the sacrifice and felled some of Brutus's allies with stones and long sticks, but the Trojans swarmed them from all sides and killed them all, except for Gog-Magog. Brutus, you see, had ordered that he be kept alive because he wanted to see a battle between him and Corynaeus. When Corynaeus heard this, he rushed down from the mountains to see the giant and call him out to fight. When the fight was at last begun, Corynaeus stood on one side, girt only in a tunic, and the giant stood on the other side, ready to rumble. Each one stretched out his bare arms to the other and formed a sort of chain of arm flesh connecting one man's back to his opponent's, stirring up the air with their constant panting. But suddenly, Gog-Magog squeezed Corynaeus with all his might, slamming his chest powerfully with his own, breaking 3 of Corynaeus's ribs. This served primarily to make Coronæus angry, which merely renewed his strength, so that he grappled the giant with the totality of his effort up onto his own shoulders and ran with as much speed as the great weight would allow towards the nearest shore. When he finally reached the top of a lofty cliff, he shook himself free and cast the deadly monster into the sea. And the giant, falling on the jagged crags, was sliced to ribbons and breathed his last, staining the waves with his blood. As a result, that place received its name from his fall and is known even to the present day as Gog-Magog's Leap. Afterwards, the Trojans began to cultivate fields and build homes in such a way that very shortly you would have thought the place had been inhabited for a long time. Later, Brutus named the island Britain, and his allies the Britons, after himself. As a result, the language of the people, which had previously been called Trojan, was subsequently known as British. Coronæus, likewise, was granted the western portion of the kingdom, which was named Coronea after him, but which now, either because of the phrase Horn of Britain, because that part of the land sticks out into the sea like a horn, or because of a corruption of that earlier name, is called Cornwall.